people just really didn't know he was the sheriff of the county when he walked in. Yes, usually if there's any trouble before it started, he'd tell me he was the sheriff of the county. But once or twice, some of them didn't pay no attention to that, and that's when they, especially one occasion I know of it, 5 or 6 of them jumped him. And he broke one of them's leg and took about 3 of them to jail.
Hello. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took a really big stick and put it in the hands of a really big man and then sent him off after a bunch of organised crime syndicates? Well, if you have, then you're in luck, because we happen to have the answer. In this episode of Absolute Legends, we're going to take a look at a man who held a line against the lawless, a man who didn't back down in the face of overwhelming odds, a man of principle who stood up against those who had none. We're talking about the bull himself, Sheriff Buford Hayse Pusser.
I didn't think too much of it then.
I don't care what other people think.
Really was coming from my face, pure and there.
Never in the field of human conscience was so much owed by so many to so few.
By the content of their character.
Where did we get such men? At the going down of the sun, we will remember them.
The turbulent life of Buford Pusser would begin in Finger, McNairy County in Tennessee on December 12th, 1937. Young Buford was a soft-spoken and timid child born to Carl and Helen Pusser. He was the youngest of 3 children, and they grew up together on a small farm during the Great Depression. Buford's father, Carl, didn't believe in government handouts and instilled in each of his children a strong work ethic and sense of justice. Carl Pusser also served as the police chief of Adamsville, something his youngest son would eventually go on to emulate. Buford's mother, Helen, claimed that her son was a very timid boy who clung tightly to her side. He refused to go to school or leave the house for any trips because he was afraid of getting lost. Instead, he would stay home and pray. Once in high school, things began to change for Buford. He grew to a height of 6 foot 6 inches tall and weighed in at 250 pounds. He excelled at basketball and football and became quite popular amongst his peers. After high school, he decided to join the Marines, intending to make a career out of it. It would have meant a tour of duty in the Vietnam War. This was never meant to be. Just 4 months into his career in the Marines, while still in training, Buford Pusser was medically discharged due to persistent asthma attacks. After being discharged, Pusser would return home to Adamsville, his pride and ego wounded by the rejection he'd experienced in the military. His mother, who was a pious woman, told him that the Lord had a place for him in life, but that it just wasn't in the military. She advised him to be patient. Although his mother's advice helped ease the embarrassment, Pusser decided to go out for a night on the town anyway. He headed out to the Plantation Club, which lay just over the Mississippi border. It was well known for its rough clientele. The club was owned by W.O. Hathcock, who was in attendance on the night that Pusser arrived. Pusser was no stranger to the kind of carry-on that proliferated around places like the Plantation Club, as he had witnessed a murder while at the Irish Club just inside the Tennessee border when he was only 16 years of age. He watched a heavy-set woman follow an old sailor out of the club, withdraw a claw hammer from underneath her apron, and proceed to bash him repeatedly in the back of the head. Disturbed by the event, Pusser and his friends decided to leave, but as they were heading out the front door, they ran into a deputy sheriff, who looked down at the dying man before asking what had happened. The woman who had just smashed the man's skull in with a hammer told the deputy sheriff that he had suffered a heart attack, and they both laughed. This was Buford Pusser's first encounter with the state line mob, which was loosely associated with a group of other crime syndicates that composed the Dixie Mafia. Although Pusser had been greatly disturbed by the brutality he'd just witnessed, he was far more disturbed by the actions of the deputy sheriff, who had covered up a blatant murder. On the night Pusser entered the Plantation Club, he was immediately lured back into the back rooms to play craps, He spent some time in there and actually did quite well, going on to win a large sum of money. Although he was in good spirits, other people weren't too happy with his success, prompting one of the dealers to swap out the dice. Pusser caught the man in the act and demanded that he resort back to the previous set. Pusser was immediately surrounded by 4 large men, who dragged him away from the gaming table and proceeded to beat the head off him with a mixture of batons and knuckle dusters. While lying on the floor of the club in a semi-conscious state, Pusser felt one of his assailants rifle through his pockets and take all of his winnings, along with all the contents of his wallet. After he'd been stripped of all valuables, the men picked him up, carried him out the front door, and dumped him into the rain-soaked night. Pusser lay there in the rain until he recovered enough strength to drag himself to his car, and then he drove himself to the medical centre in Solmer, where it took 192 stitches to close up the many lacerations about his face and head. After he'd been fixed up and received a chiding from his mother, a seething Buford Pusser decided to seek full-time employment rather than seek revenge on W.O. Hathcock, who he believed had ordered the attack on him. Pusser gained employment quickly, working for a spell as a mortician's assistant at the funeral home in Adamsville, which led to him moving to Chicago and enrolling in mortician school in 1957. While living in Chicago, he and 2 hometown friends found work at a paper mill, and in an unusual move, Pusser also became a professional wrestler on the side. This is where he picked up the nickname Buford the Bull. During his wrestling career, he became somewhat well known for wrestling and beating a live grizzly bear. Pretty sure it would have been a black bear cub, but a grizzly bear sounds much more impressive. It was at one of those professional wrestling bouts that he met a beautiful blonde woman by the name of Pauline Mullins, who was a divorcee with 2 young children. Buford and Pauline would go on to marry on December 5th, 1959, only 7 days before Pusser's 22nd birthday. I couldn't even tie my shoes at 22. The couple would enjoy marriage bliss for less than a month, before law enforcement turned up on the doorstep of the Pusser home in the late evening of January 4th, 1960. 2 detectives were there to serve an extradition order from the Corinth magistrate in Mississippi. The summons was for the immediate arrest of Buford Pusser on the grounds of the attempted murder of W.O. Hathcock. Apparently, 1 week before his wedding, on December 13th, 1959, Pusser and 2 of his friends had paid a visit to the Plantation Club, where Pusser had beaten the ever-loving crap out of Hathcock and taken back the winnings that Hathcock had stolen. Hathcock had claimed that Pusser and his 2 friends had robbed him at gunpoint and then beaten him nearly to death. A few weeks later, they were put on trial by District Attorney N.S. Sweet, referred to by Carl Pusser as being so crooked he has to screw his britches on every morning. Sick burn. W.O. Hathcock, his wife Loressie, Sheriff Coleman and his deputy, and several other corrupt law enforcement officers testified against Pusser and his friends. The only evidence presented by the prosecution was W.O. Hathcock's testimony and Sheriff Coleman's description of Pusser being a known troublemaker, despite the fact that Pusser had never been arrested on any previous charge. Sweet accused him of seeking out revenge and that he had driven hundreds of miles in order to do so, despite providing 6 eyewitnesses that testified Buford Pusser had never left the state of Illinois, and his time card proving that he had been in work at the time of the supposed attack on W.O. Hathcock. He was scoffed at by the prosecution and repeatedly condemned. Despite this, the jury retired and returned 2 hours later to deliver the verdict of not guilty. This verdict was proof to Pusser that the average citizen was tired of the corruption and the power that the state-line mob held over law enforcement. A few months after his trial, Buford Pusser returned to Adamsville with his family, which was now going to be 1 member larger. To his great joy, Pusser found out that Pauline was pregnant with their daughter Dwana, who would be born in 1961. Pusser settled back in Adamsville and resumed his career as a professional wrestler, but he soon realized that the wage he made from professional wrestling was not sufficient to support a large family, so he decided to seek out a real job. His father Carl, who at the time was still serving as police chief of Adamsville, recommended that Buford take over, as long as the town board approved. Pusser enjoyed a few quiet months as police chief, dealing only with local teenage drag racers and drunks. But after a while he became restless and wished to expand on his duties. He applied for the local district's constable office and was accepted. This would mean he now had to deal with the local bootleggers and illegal whiskey stills as well. During the course of his new duties, he would often have to deal with the local sheriff, whom he didn't like. The local sheriff was a man by the name of James Dickey, who was known to be on the take from the State Line mob. At this time, the mob had a lucrative operation going on that involved bootlegging, prostitution, and rigged gambling. The way Pusser saw it, he had no choice but to run for the position of McNairy County Sheriff if he wanted to do any real good, and he did just that in 1964. Buford Pusser ran on the promise to clean up McNairy County, saying on his stump speech that he would clean up the corruption and violence and make McNairy County a decent place to live and raise a family. Pusser quickly became the odds-on favourite to win, despite being only 24 years of age, in a staunch Republican and an overwhelmingly Democrat area. Ironically, during his campaign, he received a bribe in the mail from Louise Hathcock, owner of the Shamrock Motel, another State Line mob operation. Louise had recently shot and killed her husband in what she claimed was self-defense, but what was widely known to be murder. 2 days before the election actually took place, the incumbent sheriff James Dickey was killed in a car crash. Many believed it to be mob retribution and a warning to the incoming sheriff. No proof of foul play was ever discovered, but it seemed very suspect given that he was on the take from the mob and was now projected to lose badly to the young challenger. Regardless, Pusser went on to win the election in a landslide and was sworn in on September 1st, 1964. He was the youngest sheriff in Tennessee history. At just 26 years of age, the big man wasted no time delivering on his promise to clean up the State Line, identifying Louise Hathcock, owner of the Shamrock Motel, and Charles Towhead White, owner of the White Iris, as primary players in the State Line mob. Pusser had a problem, however. The rest of law enforcement was totally compromised. Officers regularly indulged in the prostitution, gambling, and robbery that was prolific throughout the region, and despite how popular he may have been amongst the honest citizenry and the criminal underworld, Pusser was a marked man. But the new sheriff was also a determined man, absolutely fixed on his mission to clean up the county. He regularly did circuits of the State Line, sometimes going days without sleep. For years, places like the Shamrock Motel treated criminals very well, but preyed upon innocent tourists. Many out-of-state Americans were lured into the Shamrock for the 49-cent country ham breakfast, only to be beaten and robbed by State Line thugs. This was a frequent reoccurrence, and until Pusser took the reins, absolutely nothing was ever done about it. Even though he had always been big, Buford Pusser never liked to push other people around. In fact, during his time at grade school, bullies would often make fun of him because of his size and shy demeanour. The gentle giant would always take it in good humour, but if one of those same bullies happened to pick on a smaller kid, Pusser would turn beast mode and drop the hammer on them. He'd been brought up by his father to have a good sense of justice, and by 26, he had the makings of the perfect sheriff needed to clean up McNairy County. In his early days as sheriff, Pusser didn't even carry a gun or wear a uniform. Instead, he carried around a large stick, which started off as merely a tree branch. Several people advised him that a badge and uniform would prevent a lot of the hassle he endured, but the wolf in sheep's clothing routine worked perfectly for the area. Threats on Pusser's life began to mount, and he soon suffered injuries from the resulting attacks. Within weeks of taking office, the new sheriff was stabbed in an altercation with a knife-wielding assassin. Several more attempts would be made on his life, and by the end of it, he would have received 8 gunshot wounds and 7 stab wounds, and would have killed at least 2 of his attackers. Not surprisingly, he eventually picked up a gun, his weapon of choice, a .41 caliber Magnum. By the time Pusser stood for re-election in 1966, he had more than earned the enthusiastic support of the electorate. But his wife Pauline was struggling with the constant threats and looming violence that arose from her husband taking on a deeply entrenched and politically protected crime syndicate. Pusser would go on to win re-election with ease, and once again the bribes from Louise Hathcock and Towhead White started to flow in. Towhead White, who was now regarded as the Al Capone of Alcorn County, had hooked up with Louise Hathcock as a strategic move to increase his power. On February the 1st, 1966, the McNairy County Sheriff's Office received a call from 2 young tourists out of Illinois. They claimed that while staying at the Shamrock Hotel, Louise Hathcock had held him at gunpoint and had stolen a purse. Sheriff Buford Pusser obtained a search warrant and, joined by 2 of his deputies, P.D. Plunk and Jim Moffat, headed straight for the state line. Pusser wasn't taking any chances. He knew what Hathcock was capable of. Hathcock and Towhead White had major beef with Pusser at this stage because of his successes destroying whiskey stills all over the county. Both criminals had enjoyed great profits from bootlegging the illegal whiskey in the past, and it was a major source of their income. As a result of Sheriff Pusser's pressure, Towhead White was forced to move his illegal whiskey operation out of McNairy County and into Tashomingo County in Mississippi. This move would end up backfiring for the Al Capone of Alcorn County, as in 1965, Sheriff James Bishop of Tashomingo County, along with federal agents, arrested Towhead White on the charge of running an illegal whiskey still in the state of Mississippi. Towhead White was thus sent to federal prison in Alabama, so he was out of the way when Pusser and his deputies headed to the Shamrock to arrest Hathcock on February 1st. The Shamrock Motel was spread out into multiple sections. Hathcock's office lay just through the lobby and the rear of the building. When Pusser and his deputies found her, she was sitting in her office with a drink in her hand, and after being confronted, she asked to speak with Sheriff Pusser alone. Pusser agreed, and she brought him through a side door that led into the bedroom she used when staying over at the motel. Once through the door, Hathcock produced a .38 pistol and spun to face the sheriff. It is not known whether she pulled the weapon from her pocket or received it from her dresser like she had done when killing her husband. She screamed, "I'm gonna kill you," and pulled the trigger. Pusser dove onto the bed to his left, the bullet narrowly missing his head. Hathcock readjusted her aim and pulled the trigger again, but this time the weapon misfired. Pusser shot back, pulling the trigger a total of 3 times. The first bullet struck Hathcock in the shoulder, spinning her around. The second bullet tore a trench across her chest and neck, and finally the third bullet struck her in the head. She fell to the floor, still holding her drink. Even though Pusser was cleared of the shooting after the investigation that followed, some have claimed that Hathcock never actually fired at Pusser at all. They claim that it was the sheriff who fired first, then arranged for the scene afterwards to make it look like it had been self-defense. I think that's unlikely. If he'd wanted to kill Hathcock, then why would he be bringing 2 deputies along with him? And why did Hathcock want to be alone with him in the first place? It's worth remembering that Hathcock had killed her husband in much the same manner as she attempted to kill Pusser. I reckon she fancied her chances. Also, she was so drunk that her reaction speed would have been way down, her aim would have been way off, and her judgment would have been about as good as mine was after a night on the juice. In my humble opinion, this was simply a terminal case of Dutch courage. When considering this scenario, we must also take into account the number of shots that Pusser fired. 3 in total, and given the grouping they would have had to have been fired in quick succession. That's panic fire to me. If he'd fired first, surely he would have aimed properly. Anyway, the news of Louise Hathcock's death didn't go down too well with our business partner and reluctant lover Towhead White. He and a fellow inmate by the name of French would escape from minimum security prison on December 11, 1966. About a month after the escape, Sheriff Buford Pusser attempted to stop a speeding car on Highway 45, a light green Chrysler with Mississippi plates. 2 men were inside. As Pusser approached the passenger door of the car, he was shot 3 times and left to die. The Chrysler sped away from the scene. Somehow Pusser was able to get back in his car and drive himself to the hospital in Selmer, again, despite being shot full of holes. 3 days later, on January the 5th, 1967, Towhead White turned himself in. He knew that the law were after him. During the next 7 months, Towhead White orchestrated Pusser's assassination from his prison cell. He made arrangements with Kursky Nix Jr. to carry out the hit. In the early hours of August 12, 1967, a phone call was placed to the home of Sheriff Pusser, telling him that there was emergency somewhere out on the New Hope Road, which lay down in the southern part of the county. Pusser jumped out of bed to get ready, and his wife Pauline decided that she wanted to go with him, maybe due to the threatening phone calls making her feel unsafe. It was still dark when Sheriff Pusser and Pauline left their home in Adamsville, heading south towards New Hope Road. What Pusser didn't know was that a dark-coloured 1965 Cadillac carrying 3 men was lurking just behind the New Hope Church, which lay on the way to the scene of the reported emergency. As the sheriff drove past, the Cadillac pulled out from behind the church and sped after the couple with its lights turned off. According to Sheriff Pusser, as he was approaching the bridge up ahead, the Cadillac suddenly switched on its lights and raced up alongside them. The darkness was suddenly lit up by bright muzzle flashes and loud cracks as the three men inside the Cadillac opened fire on the sheriff's car. Pauline, who was sitting in the passenger seat, was struck in the head and killed instantly. Quickly reacting to the ambush, Pusser put his foot to the floor and pulled out in front of the attackers. After a few miles of breakneck speed, the Cadillac disappeared behind him, and the sheriff figured that they must have veered off to make their getaway. Pusser immediately pulled over to the side of the road so he could check on his wife Pauline. After confirming that she was dead, the grief-stricken sheriff didn't even get time to process what had just happened, before the Cadillac re-emerged from the darkness and opened fire again. Sheriff Pusser was hit several times, one of the rounds blowing his lower left jaw off and taking half of his face with it. The sheriff slumped over and fell to the floor of his car, and thinking him dead, the driver of the Cadillac gunned the engine, and with screeching tires it tore off into the night, leaving behind a badly wounded Buford Pusser. Despite the state of shock and horrific injuries, Pusser somehow managed to reach for the car radio and call out for help. With his jaw shattered and dangling, he was unable to form words, but the dispatcher knew it was him and that he was in trouble, so was quick to send out help. Sheriff Buford Pusser was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. He would spend 18 days in that hospital, missing his own wife's funeral. Pusser would also undergo 16 surgeries over the coming years to restore some functionality to his jaw and reconstruct his face. The one and only Elvis Presley, who was an admirer of Pusser's, paid for all his medical bills. After he recovered well enough, Pusser stated that he could identify two of the shooters, but wasn't sure about the third man, that being Kirsky Nix Jr. Later, he would flat out refuse to identify Nix at all. Some took this to mean that the sheriff planned to take care of Nix himself. There's no doubt in my mind that Sheriff Pusser knew it was Towhead White who had orchestrated the hit. They were mortal enemies, and it had occurred only 7 months after the shooting of Louise Hathcock. Pusser had also been made aware that Kirsky Nix Jr. and two other men had stayed in the Shamrock Motel the night before the attack. Even if Pusser identified Kirsky Nix Jr., the State Line mob would have no shortage of alibis for the killers. 1 year after the ambush, Towhead White was released from prison in September of 1968, and just over 6 months later, on April 4th, 1969, Towhead pulled into the El Rey Motel in Corinth, Mississippi, with the estranged wife of Barry Smith Jr. in tow. Unfortunately for him, Smith was part owner of the El Rey Motel and was actually standing outside when they arrived. The official version of the story is that upon seeing Barry Smith, Towhead drew a gun and started shooting. Smith ran back into the office to retrieve his own weapon, before running back outside to return fire, killing Towhead while he was still sitting in the driver's seat of his car. And some even say that Sheriff Pusser paid Smith to kill Towhead, but all of it is unsubstantiated. Barry Smith Jr. was not charged with the shooting of Towhead White. Those in law enforcement were so relieved that White was dead and his reign of terror was over that they didn't see much point in investigating any claims other than those of Smith. The shooting was ruled as self-defense, and nothing else was ever done. In 1971, Kirsky Nix Jr. was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Frank Corso, a New Orleans grocery executive, while Nix was breaking into his home. In 1987, Nix was also convicted of the murder for hire killing of Judge Vincent Sherry and his wife Margaret in Biloxi, Missouri. His co-conspirator, Biloxi Mayor P. Halat, had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from Nix and blamed the judge. Nix would be charged and convicted of orchestrating the crime from prison and would be confined to isolation for the remainder of his life. As of the recording of this video, Nix still resides in prison. He is 78 years of age. In the years that followed, a movie based on Pusser's experience would be released. 1973's Walking Tall is a dramatised version of the events of Sheriff Buford Pusser's life. It was a low-budget movie, but worth a watch. On the 21st of August, 1974, Buford Pusser returned from Memphis, Tennessee, after just signing the contract to play himself in the sequel to Walking Tall. He had just left the McNairy County Fair in Selmer, and was headed back home to Adamsville, a journey of only 12 miles. As he was known to do, he was driving his 1-year-old Corvette at high speed, when he suddenly lost control of the vehicle and slid 300 feet across the westbound lane, straight into an embankment. Buford Pusser was thrown out the open roof of his Corvette as it exploded into flames. He was killed on impact, suffering a broken neck and many other gruesome injuries. To add to the horrific tragedy of Buford's last moments, his young daughter Dwana was travelling with friends just behind him when he crashed. Unfortunately, she witnessed the entire aftermath. Sheriff Buford Hayse Pusser would be buried in Adamsville Cemetery next to his wife Pauline. He was only 36 years of age. In the years that followed, several conspiracy theories built up around the life and death of Sheriff Pusser. The lore took on a life of its own, applying to an already incredible story exaggerated details that were just not necessary. He didn't hunt down and kill all the men involved in his wife's murder. That's just Hollywood. Kirsky Nix Jr. is actually still alive and behind bars. Carmine R. Gagliardi died of an overdose in prison. And George Albert McGann, who was a prolific gambler and in debt to very serious people, was killed in a poker game on September 30th, 1970. However, in regards to Towhead White, it is somewhat plausible that Pusser was involved. We'll just never know for sure. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that there is a group of people who believe that Buford Pusser was some kind of criminal mastermind, who along with his father Carl ran a criminal empire that was tied in with the state line mob. This conspiracy theory portrays a Buford Pusser that is so far removed from the known character of the man that it doesn't hold water. The fact is that the people of Adamsville and McNairy County, who knew Sheriff Pusser personally, always sang his praises at every opportunity. McNairy County still celebrates the life of the heroic sheriff to this day, holding a Buford Pusser festival every May. Pusser was a man who liked to walk tall, but he also never backed down, not even when it almost cost him his life. He did things his own way and on his own terms. He had a strong and deeply ingrained sense of justice and hated to see the bully prevail. He served the people of McNairy County diligently for many years and suffered great tragedies in order to do so. His refusal to back down, coupled with his unrelenting drive to clean up the criminal syndicates that had brought his county to ruin, won him a lot of favour across the entire United States. His unwavering sense of duty and justice made him an American hero, and that legacy would go on to be noticed all around the world. One thing is for certain, the Vietnamese are very lucky he had asthma. It would have taken a damn anti-tank missile to put a stop to that fella. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode. To those of you who have made it this far, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm very grateful for you spending time with me here today. I really appreciate it. And as usual, take care and God bless.
I knew Buford Pusser ever since he took office in '64. He made my place nearly every night or most every night. He was a good man.